Hello and welcome to Ben TV. My name is Patricia Iannaci and I will be interviewing the civil rights activist Mark Levy.
Well, Barnett, don't you know, Mississippi is the next to go. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, why don't you hold on? Hold on.
What was your position at the Mississippi Freedom School?
I was coordinator of one of the largest freedom schools in Mississippi, just by accident, not for any special reason or expertise that I brought. There were freedom schools all around the state of Mississippi, and the freedom schools were just a small part of the movement that was going on. The major effort at that time in Mississippi, that eventually became called Freedom Summer, was around voter registration. The musicians came, lawyers came, doctors came, as well as the freedom school teachers and voter registration. And they were from all over the country, or almost all over the country. There were very few white Southern volunteers, but most of the other people came from Maine. There were people from New Jersey. There was one guy in my group, his name was Ronnie D'Souza, who was from New Jersey, Long Island, Vermont, Minnesota, literally all over the country. It wasn't just a New York thing. Black people were trying to register to vote. The names were published in newspapers. They were fired. They were beaten up. They were stopped from registering. It was a whole huge struggle. And freedom schools were an ancillary part of that movement, but connected to it. And because the schools were part of a social movement, made them particularly exciting. The family that wanted to register to vote would also send their kids to freedom schools. Civil rights organizations that were trying to do voter registration understood it was a long-term struggle. A lot of the leadership of that came from young people, so they were well aware that they wanted to recruit more young people, and the freedom schools were real schools that took place sometimes in a church building, sometimes on somebody's lawn or on their porch or in the back of a store. That was part of building a high school student movement that would be part of the civil rights movement in the subsequent year. So I was the coordinator of the Meridian Freedom School, which just happened to be the biggest school in the state. It was a Baptist seminary.
Okay.
We were in a 3-story brick building. It was the only school like that in the state. One of the things that was so critically important was that each community had invited us to come down, which meant they had to find places for us to live. You know, we were an integrated group. We were mainly white group, and in Mississippi, it wasn't like we were going to go to stay in a local hotel. We were the civil rights workers. We were the enemy, you know, in terms of the police and the Klan. We had to stay in homes of local black people who invited us into their homes. We were going to go home at the end of the summer to New York or California or wherever people lived, and the people who had us in the homes were going to stay there. It was the same thing with the freedom schools. The churches or the stores or the Baptist seminary was going to stay in the community and stay as a target after the summer was over.
And while you were in the school, did you teach with students directly?
I taught part-time. My role was more like a principal that time. I worked with the high school student organization, and I taught one class. The one class that I taught was called the Core Citizenship class. And it was very exciting because we asked questions about what the world would look like if we could bring about some of the changes, and what kind of changes would we want to bring. And we asked very critical questions. We asked, what does the civil rights movement want? What does white culture have that you don't have, that you would like to bring? What does white culture have that's bad, that if we built a new world you would not want to include? What does black culture have that's good or exciting that we would like to emphasize and bring into a new world? What does it have that's bad that you would not want to carry over? And then the next two questions that were part of the class were even more important than those other questions, which was, what do whites nor blacks not have? What does nobody have at this time that we would like to build into a new world? And then the last question is, how do we go from here to there? What's the movement all about? What's the nonviolent direct action approach able to accomplish?
Had these kids that came into the school been educated prior?
Schools were segregated. You know, the Supreme Court decision was what, 54? And this was 64. And the schools in Mississippi were still 100% segregated. The state of Mississippi did not start complying with the Supreme Court 54 decision until about 1965. Schools became desegregated. I don't think they ever really became truly integrated. There were some unexpected consequences. I think the state started cutting some of the funding by having one school system. They kept most of the white teachers and laid off a lot of the black teachers from the segregated schools. So there were some downsides as well as some upsides. Just the the students came prepared. They were eager. It was voluntary. They had a lot of smarts from their own experience. They had a lot of eagerness and discipline. There were things that they did not have opportunities to do in their segregated schools. For the most part, foreign languages weren't taught. For the most part, typing wasn't taught. And in the 60s, typing was terribly important. There was not as much time for art or dance or music in the segregated schools. And in the freedom schools, we not only had courses on Black history and on the civil rights movement, we were able to incorporate other kinds of creative courses, kids writing poetry, kids doing art, expressive things, putting out their own newspaper. So it was a very exciting time, and the kids really got into it, and it was exciting for them.
About how many students were in your school?
250.
150?
Yeah.
Were any of the students that attended the school threatened because of their involvement?
Students were threatened by their principal and by their teachers. They were told that if they attended the Freedom School that summer, that they would be thrown out of school when they went in the fall. The same thing happened. We had the first day of school, one teacher showed up to volunteer. And we're talking about one black teacher showed up to volunteer. Remember, these were segregated schools, and that the principal of the segregated school was black. We used the term at the time, Negro schools. And the students were all threatened and told that they would be suspended in the fall. That actually didn't happen, but they were threatened. And the other thing that happened, and I didn't know about this until when I was back in Mississippi a couple of years ago, a group of girls would go home at the end of the day on a certain bus line. And when the school was over, they would walk out to the bus stop. And what they told me was that on a number of occasions, a group of white guys would drive by in a car and throw balloons, and these were balloons filled with urine at them. And they never told us about it. And they would just come back the next day and next day and next day, and they were not intimidated. And I asked, why didn't you tell us? And they said, we didn't want you to, feel sorry for us. We didn't want you to be afraid or have any sense that we were, being attacked. So they were particularly brave and kept quiet about their experience. So there was a lot of pressure on students not to go to the Freedom School.
Ain't gonna let nobody load it. Turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody load it. Turn me round, keep on a walking, yeah, keep on a talking, marching up the freedom land. Ain't gonna let segregation load it. Turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let segregation.
What brought you to Mississippi in the summer of '64, 50 years ago?
Well, I think there are probably two or three different main things that brought me to the point of deciding to go. First is I was asked by somebody who I trusted and respected, with all the Facebook and social media and tweeting and twitting and all that kind of stuff. The information just goes out. But for me, what was important was there was personal contact, and there was somebody I respected said, Mark, would you come? And I was married at that time, and Mark, would you and Betty come? And it was somebody who I then could ask questions of and who told me about the organizations that were sponsoring it. So a big part was the way I was asked. Another part that sort of led to my being able to and willing to say yes was the fact that I'm Jewish. And this was in '63, and I grew up during World War II and after World War II, and my family, part of my family was lost during the Holocaust and during the war. And besides that, there was discrimination in New York against Jews. People don't think or aren't aware of that now. Columbia University and the Ivy League had a quota of how many Jews they would take in. So I grew up with this idea that discrimination was bad. Whoever was being discriminated against, if you discriminated against anybody or a few, you'd be next, or you could be next. So that there was a real commitment towards social justice, towards fighting against any kind of discrimination. So in my family background, I was prepared to say yes. My wife came from a trade union and activist background, and her parents said yes faster than my parents said yes. So we were ready to do that, and we were aware of the situation, not only in the South, but how the situation in the South affected the situation in the North. A handful of congressmen got elected over and over and over again because voting rights were denied to people in the South, and they exerted an extraordinary amount of power in the Senate. They were called the Dixiecrats at the time, and the Dixiecrats could defeat any legislation nationally, so that what happened in the South affected the North. All of those things together with one other factor allowed me to say yes. And I think I would describe that factor as sort of a sense of hope. One of my great disappointments, part of me said I should have expected it, but I guess I had a degree of hope, was when I went to the synagogue in Meridian, Mississippi. In New York, my synagogue on the west side of New York had been supportive. They had given money, they had given materials, and they said it was a good thing. So I go to Mississippi, and my wife and I, one of the first days, the first week or so, went to the Meridian Synagogue when services were about to start. So it was, I don't remember now whether it was a Friday evening or Saturday morning, but as we started to walk up the steps to the synagogue, a woman came out and asked us not to come in. And we said, well, we just want to come here because it's the services. And they said, you are not wanted here. You are not welcome here. And she said, we are Southerners first. And I had a sense that, or hope that because I was Jewish, I would be able to connect with Jews in Mississippi, because I had certain understandings about discrimination, that I would be able to talk to other Jews in Mississippi who are much more of a minority in Mississippi than they are in New York, and that we could have some sort of conversation. I didn't expect them to pick up signs and run around, but I expected I'd be able to sit in the back of the synagogue and participate in the service, but we weren't allowed in.
And that really is amazing, because you think that, synagogues, no matter what it is, would always let people in. And it's amazing that they didn't.
The Catholic Church was segregated in Meridian. There were some nuns who were sympathetic to what was going on. They clearly were not in full control of the school. And I know one of the students who became an activist, in fact, was thrown out of parochial school because he just wore a civil rights button. So it's not just the synagogues, it was the churches also. The pressure on institutions that you would have thought better of came in two different kinds of ways. There were some people, some whites in the synagogues, some whites in the churches, who were segregationists, who were avowed racists. There were some who were more, to use the Southern term, moderate. But the pressure that was put on them was absolutely amazing. The Ku Klux Klan, the White Citizens Council, the local governments would pressure white folks.
Did you witness any violent acts of prejudice or just any types of prejudice toward any of the students or the people around you?
3 people in the same town, 3 civil rights workers in the same town, had been captured and killed just weeks before I went. I knew them. Their names were James Chaney, who was a local Meridian guy, Mickey Schwerner, who was an organizer. He was originally from New York, and he was working with a civil rights organization called CORE. And then there was Andy Goodman, who was a student at Queens College, and we had just finished orientation, and he went to Mississippi, and within 24 hours, he was in a car with the other 2 people looking at a church that had been burned that was supposed to be used for voter registration and for Freedom School. The police arrested those 3 guys, kept them in jail, released them at a time they knew that the Klan was waiting to capture them. So they got out of jail, they drove their car a little while, and the Klan then grabbed them and brutally killed them and buried them under a dam. So there was that kind of violence. That was not a new violence from Mississippi. Lynching had been going on there for years. When they were looking for Goodman, Chaney, Schwerner bodies, they found bodies in all the rivers and things like that. I think there were like 30 or 40 church burnings during the summer. I was lucky. I did not personally experience that.
Segregation, Lordy, turn me round, keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, yeah, marching up to freedom, yeah. Ain't gonna let no jailhouse, Lordy, turn me round, turn me round, turn me round, ain't gonna let no jailhouse, turn me round, keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom, yeah.
One of the things that I've enjoyed about talking to people about the civil rights movement is that it sort of forced me to learn new things. And for 40 years or 45 years, I wondered where the lunch came from to the Freedom School every day. Polly Heidelberg, Ms. Heidelberg, would show up every day with lunch for about 50 people, teachers and some of the students who didn't go home. And it was just great. And I just, I was a young kid. I was in my 20s when I was down there. I never said to myself, where does this lunch come from? But then after I was a teacher, I also worked for a union, and so I was involved in organizing issues. And at some point I said to myself, where did that lunch come from? Mrs. Heidelberg, could she bring all of that stuff? And when I was in Mississippi about 4 years ago, I found and went to visit Ms. Turner, who had been my host, whose home I'd stayed in. And I said, I've been dying to ask you a question. Where did all the lunches come from? And Ms. Turner really laughed, and she said, Ms. Heidelberg organized that. When the civil rights groups and the minister had gone to church to say, can you put up the volunteers who are coming down? A number of people raised their hands, and Ms. Heidelberg collected their names. And the next day, she then went to some of her friends who didn't raise their hands and say, why didn't you volunteer to put some of those people up? And a number of the families who were in church that day, they had a very good answer. They said, look, I work in a white person's home. It's just me, and I'm afraid if I'm seen taking a white couple in or a white volunteer in, that I'm going to lose my job, and I'm not prepared to do that yet. So I'm afraid that's why I didn't agree to do that. And Ms. Heidelberg, who had only gone through school through the second grade, which doesn't indicate at all how smart she was, she then said to them, okay, so you're not willing to do that. What are you willing to do? Because different people can do different things at different points in their life. And Ms. Heidelberg was the wonderful organizer. And what she and these other ladies came up with was they formed a sort of a secret committee where they would make lunch in their homes early in the morning, and somewhere between 5 and 6 before they went off to their regular jobs, they would drive over to Ms. Heidelberg's house and they would give her sandwiches or food that they made. And then that was all done secretly, and then Ms. Heidelberg could bring the lunches to us. That made sense to me. As somebody who had been an organizer, who had tried to get people to do things and had encountered some people saying, no, I will do it, no, I won't do it, yes, I'll do this, but not that. This was like a quintessential story, and it also showed how within a community there are different levels of support.
Have you visited Mississippi recently?
Since I retired, I've been there, about 4 times back to Meridian. Before that, there had been reunions of some of the civil rights activists, both SNCC and core local Mississippi activists. There's an organization called the Veterans of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. I'd gone to a number of conferences there, but I hadn't gone back to the town I worked in at all for 40 odd years. And then I went back and found some of the people I knew from back then. It's been wonderful having gone back and visited and made some contacts.
What year did you go back, like specifically?
What year did I go back? Probably about 6 years ago, 7 years ago.
Okay. What was different that you noticed?
What was different? A lot was different. The whole downtown was really decimated in the sense that one of the things that happened right after '64 that didn't explicitly have to do with the civil rights movement was that the interstate highway system was being built. In the same way as it impacts in New Jersey, a lot of the interstate highways went around the towns. So whereas there were vital centers of the town and where people would do their shopping or their eating would be in town, life started moving to the interchanges where national chains would move in next to the interstate. So the businesses, and particularly the black community, the black owned and the black patronized stores that had been in the downtown areas, all the business was going out by the interstates. So that changed the towns an awful lot. That was one of the first things that I noticed. So it was not only the interchange, but the taking over a lot of the business by the national chains instead of the local businesses. My Freedom School had been abandoned. That Baptist seminary had been pretty much abandoned after '64. It had burned down, it had burned, and probably about 6 months before I went the first time, it had been bulldozed. So when I went back to see it, that was an empty site. I went back to the building that had been our civil rights office in '64, and it was still standing. It's still standing now, but it's in shaky condition. It's been designated as a landmark, and I hope that people get the money to save it. It was badly hit in Katrina. It's off the coast. Meridian is way back in sort of central Mississippi, but Katrina had really hurt the area, so the building is not stable. So a lot of the historic sites were not there. A lot of streets had gotten names named after some civil rights activists. That was sort of a symbolic difference. And I went to visit some of the churches we had been active in, and a couple of them were very welcoming, and some were not interested. And I tried to go back and make contact with the synagogue and some of the old timers who 40 years before, had said, no, don't come here. I wanted to go talk to them or their children, and I couldn't get to talk to them still again.
They didn't let you in?
It wasn't quite as formal. A lot of them had moved away or moved to the suburbs, so it would have meant a little extra effort. But I knew people who knew them and knew the kids. And in all of my visits, several attempts were made, but nobody wanted to sit down and talk about those times. It may be painful, it may be embarrassment, they may have the same feelings. I have no idea why nobody would see me. But that didn't happen. However, the other thing that did happen that I should mention is the pressure that existed on some white moderates. That changed. There were some good white folks who I met. The retired president of what had been the segregated all-white community college that was desegregated under his time as president of the community college. He's a wonderful guy, and he works in many multiracial situations. There's some activists who are concerned about education. There were some wonderful white school teachers I met. So there were some terrific people in the white community who were open to multiracial activities who would have been severely trounced on before. That was one of the biggest changes. The editor of the newspaper, somebody at the TV station, we could sit and have conversations. There were pressures on all those folks. You know, the pressures never went away, but they were able better to deal with it. So I think that's one of the big changes that I saw.
Thank you for joining us. You've been a great help.
My pleasure.
Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, why don't you hold on? Samuel Blunt was locked in jail, had no money for to go his bail. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, why don't you hold on? Hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, why don't you hold on? Well, Bonnet, Bonnet, don't you